Good day all. This talk will examine the tradition of subjectivism. Subjectivism consists of those theories that focus on the subjective side of society, in other words, on what people think. Like structuralism and Marxism, subjectivism in sociology evolved from 18th and 19th century European philosophy. At that time, philosophy was greatly concerned with trying to understand the nature of subjectivity and the relationship between the subjective and the objective. In the early 18th century, English philosopher John Locke argued that everything we know is by definition subjective, so we can never be sure that we know the objective world because all we have are our subjective opinions about the world. In the 19th century, German philosopher Georg developed the theory of idealism. This theory argued that the whole universe, including the human race, is born with a potential which it strives to fulfill. For humanity, that primarily consists of developing our minds by improving our understanding of ourselves and of the universe. For Hegel, ideas are the driving force of history. As we understand more, we come up with ideas for how to do things better, and then we put those ideas into practice. Idealism, with its emphasis on the subjective, was the school of thought that Marx rebelled against in developing his theory of materialism, which emphasizes the objective. Despite Marx, idealism remained very influential in Germany, and in particular influenced two German theorists who have become big names in sociology. Max Weber, who lived from 1864 to 1920, and Georg Simmel, who lived from 1858 to 1918. The two were close friends. Neither thought of himself as a sociologist. Weber saw himself primarily as a historian, Simmel saw himself as a philosopher. Despite this, they were largely responsible for bringing the subjectivist tradition into sociology. Weber did not describe himself as an idealist or a subjectivist, but rather as an eclectic, which is basically someone who tries to look at everything that matters in any situation. He did not believe that history could be explained by any one factor, be it the evolution of the mind, as Hegel argued, or of the economy, as Marx argued, or whatever. Instead, Weber looked at both subjective and objective factors in all of his historical analyses. However, all of his main contributions are in the analysis of subjective areas, such as religion, status, bureaucracy, and rationality. He also espoused the methodology of Verstehen, which is German for understanding. He said social scientists need to understand how common people understand the world. In other words, we need to get inside their heads and understand their motivations. He demonstrated this method in his most famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, where he argued that the Protestant work ethic provided the spirit or religious motivation for the rise of capitalism. Weber was also concerned that bureaucracy was creating what he called an iron cage of rules and regulations which were taking away individual freedom. Simmel was similarly concerned about the loss of individual freedom, but where Weber focused on bureaucracy, Simmel focused on money. He said that money had changed the way people think and changed the nature of social relations. He said money has reified social relations, human relations. To reify means to take something living and make it into a thing or object. So, money has made personal human relationships into impersonal relationships. We communicate with most people solely by exchanging money. Making money rather than forming relationships has become the main goal of most people's lives, and so we are becoming increasingly alienated from other people. Simmel was also very influential on Robert Park, an American who went to Germany and studied under Simmel. In the 1890s, when the University of Chicago created the first sociology department in North America, Park became one of its leading figures and brought Simmel's ideas with him. The department attracted a number of other prominent theorists, and together they became known as the Chicago School, the first school of sociology developed in North America. The Chicago School dominated North American sociology until Talcott Parsons developed structural functionalism at Harvard in the late 1930s. The Chicago School examined different aspects of subjectivity. Park focused on the rise of urban culture and neighborhood subcultures using Chicago as a case study. Charles Horton Cooley and George Herbert Mead focused on the development of self or self-image in children. W.I. Thomas focused on the creation of meaning and how people base their actions on their definition of the situation. He coined the Thomas theorem, which states, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. I would paraphrase that in less sexist and more modern terms as subjective definitions have objective consequences. An obvious example of this may be seen in a courtroom. If the judge and jury define the defendant as not guilty, he goes home. But if they define him as guilty, he goes to jail. The subjective definitions of the judge and jury have objective consequences for the defendant. In the late 1930s, Herbert Blumer synthesized the ideas of the Chicago School into a school of thought which he called Symbolic Interactionism. As the name implies, this approach focuses on how people interact using symbols such as language. For Blumer, as for Weber and Thomas, people act on the basis of their understanding or definition of their situation. Or in other words, they act on the basis of the meaning which the things in their life have for them. For Blumer, the key to understanding human behavior lies in understanding the meanings that people attribute to social situations and understanding how they arrived at those meanings. Meaning, said Blumer, is the basis of society, and meaning is subjective. It exists only in our minds. The subjectivist tradition remains strong in Germany, and there in the 1960s we saw the rise of the school of phenomenology. This was originally developed by German philosophers like Edmund Husserl and Alfred Schutz, but became influential in sociology after Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann together wrote The Social Construction of Reality, published in 1966. In this text, they argued that social reality is not fixed, but is rather constructed and reconstructed every day by people just getting up and deciding to go about their lives. But they also argued that life can largely consist of routines, which become so taken for granted that they become a trap. We do them without even thinking about them. So they tried to bring out our hidden background assumptions about life. In doing so, phenomenology introduced a new focus on understanding everyday life into sociology. The examination of everyday life was taken up in the US, especially by Harold Garfinkel at UCLA, who in the 60s developed the school of ethnomethodology. This term is a contraction of ethnographic methodology. Ethnography is a method borrowed from anthropology. For anthropologists, it simply consists of going to some tribal society and carefully observing and writing down everything they do. Ethnomethodologists applied this technique to modern industrial society. They examined everyday activities like walking and talking and found that people create a whole world of symbolic cues for interaction, which we're not even consciously aware of, but which we all follow, and which are indeed essential for society to operate. For example, conversation analysis has shown that when we talk, we don't just use words. The conversation also has a hidden structure of emphasis, intonation, hand gestures, facial expressions, and so on. These cues tell us when it's our turn to speak, or when we're expected to laugh or look sympathetic, and so on. The 60s also saw the rise of the Second Chicago School, which included Canadian-born Irving Goffman. He too focused on everyday social interaction and developed what he termed dramaturgy or dramaturgical theory, which says that people play social roles in much the same way that actors play theatrical roles, creating different personas that match other people's expectations for each role. Now, unlike the other three theoretical traditions in sociology, the subjectivism that we've looked at so far has been mostly apolitical. It has concerned itself with issues more abstract than those of politics. However, the 60s was the time when American culture, including American sociology, became heavily politicized. So, in the 60s, American subjectivism split into a right-wing approach and a left-wing approach. The right-wing approach was called exchange theory, and the left-wing approach was called labeling theory. Exchange theory was developed by Georg at Harvard. Homans argued that society only exists because people need to exchange goods and services in order to survive. Society, he said, is primarily a marketplace in which individuals try to maximize their benefits or their profits. Homans' focus is on individuals' decisions. For him, society is just a side effect of individual choices, individual actions, and exchanges between individuals. This individualism is part of traditional American culture, and it is also a traditional right-wing viewpoint. In the 1980s, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher based herself on exchange theory when she famously said, "There's no such thing as society," and then used that argument to justify cutbacks to social programs and basically gutting the British welfare state. Individualism basically means every man and woman for themselves. This was the philosophy that underlay the rise of the political new right in the 70s and 80s. In academic terms, exchange theory also evolved into network theory in the 70s and rational choice theory in the 80s. As the names imply, they both see society as a network of individuals making rational choices, and the focus is on subjective individual decisions. Labeling theory was developed by Howard Becker. Becker was also part of the Second Chicago School. He is most famous for writing a book called Outsiders, published in 1963. Like other theorists in this tradition, Becker looked at how society establishes meanings. But, unlike theorists like Bloomer, who emphasize that social cooperation is necessary to establish shared meanings, Becker argued that meanings are also established through social conflict. Different social groups often engage in a struggle over social definitions because, as I said, subjective definitions have objective consequences. For example, Western society has seen a lengthy struggle over the definition of abortion. One side wants to define it as a woman's right to control over her own body. The other side wants to define it as murder. Which definition society as a whole accepts determines whether or not a woman can legally obtain an abortion. Moreover, in the struggle to define social reality, not all sides are equal. Some have much more influence than others. As we've seen, Marx argued that the ruling class defines social reality through the ruling ideology. Becker took a more micro approach and argued that authority figures often apply negative labels to marginal social groups or groups of outsiders, claiming that they're immoral and a menace to society, even though they're not. And the real goal, said Becker, is just to get more money and power for those authority figures by leading a so-called moral crusade against the outsiders. The authority figures, said Becker, operate as what he termed moral entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur is someone who benefits from some action, so a moral entrepreneur benefits from promoting a particular moral position to society at large. The ultimate historical example of labeling is Adolf Hitler and the Nazis rising to power by saying, "Blame the Jews." But Becker looked at groups who'd been unfairly demonized and persecuted in the US, such as marijuana smokers, who he argued were imprisoned solely to raise the budget of the Drug Enforcement Agency and the power of America's politicians. Labeling creates a perverse form of social balance. It allows one group to rise up in society by pushing another group down. Finally, the 80s and 90s saw the rise of post-structuralism, which became postmodernism, and which is still popular, at least in some intellectual circles. Postmodernism takes us right back to John Locke and argues that we can never know objective reality or truth. All we ever have are just different people's opinions. So, sociologists should stop trying to establish the truth and should instead just record every individual and group's opinion because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. This is essentially relativism. Everybody is right for themselves. I would argue that postmodernism applies to the subjective world, but not to the objective world. In other words, it applies to art, but not to science. In art, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So, something can be beautiful for one person, but ugly for another, and both are right for themselves. Everyone's equally entitled to their own subjective opinion. But In science, something is objectively either right or wrong. It is not a matter of opinion. For example, the world is not and never was flat, no matter how many people thought it was. This is why I would argue that postmodernism is not really a scientific approach. It provides an extreme subjectivism which tries to define away objective reality. However, it is still the in thing for some sociologists. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day all.